Chapter 17, Screencast 1, An Introduction to the Endocrine System. Now, this is the first screencast for Chapter 17, and we will be focusing on the endocrine system, which is actually the chemical control system within our body. The previous chapter that we discussed, Chapter 15, was autonomic nervous system, so part of the electrical control system. So together, we have a total of 2 control systems within the human body, an electrical system and a chemical or endocrine system. Now, when we use the term endocrine, it is very specific to a type of gland. And endocrine glands are glands that do not have a duct, and they are going to synthesize and secrete hormones. These hormones are going to be released typically into the bloodstream. That's how they're transported through the body, and they will make their way to target cells that have a specific receptor for that hormone. So quite often you'll hear me use the term chemical messenger in place of a hormone, because that's really what they are. Now, if we are looking at the diverse functions of the endocrine system, if we think about the maintenance of homeostasis, so blood composition, blood volume, the control of digestive processes, most of us probably think the role of the endocrine system and reproductive activities. But also if we look at development, growth, metabolism, they are all under the impact or control to some degree of the endocrine system. Now, this particular diagram here is trying to illustrate the difference between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So I'm going to look first at the first panel here. And so here we have a motor neuron. And now once activated, that motor neuron is going to release neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters will actually diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to a receptor. Now, what we're going to be looking at now is a big difference with the endocrine system. So now we're going to find that endocrine system, the organ, will release a hormone. That hormone will actually circulate through the bloodstream, gets to its target, and then basically bind to the receptor for that hormone on the target cell. Now, here, this particular diagram is addressing the major endocrine glands, organs, and those tissues that contain endocrine cells. We are going to be focusing this chapter on the left panel. So what we'll be covering will be the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, thyroid, and adrenal gland. Now, we will include the pancreas because of the role of the endocrine pancreas and what it plays with respect to regulation of blood glucose. We will address all of the other remaining organs that have some endocrine cells, thus an endocrine function, when we get to the appropriate system that addresses those organs. Now, a really important term here is how are endocrine organs stimulated? And there's 3 different ways. The first is hormonal stimulation. You may hear this described as tropic. So what's happening here is an endocrine gland is releasing a hormone, and the target is another endocrine organ and the release of another hormone. The example that they're giving here is a really good example. We look at the antipituitary. It is releasing thyroid-stimulating hormone. The target is the thyroid, and because of thyroid-stimulating hormone, we will now see the thyroid release thyroid hormone or thyroxine. We have another type called humoral stimulation. Humoral refers to circulating in fluid. There's 2 really good examples that we can address when we talk about this type of stimulation. The one that we're probably most familiar with is the role of the pancreas with respect to the regulation of blood glucose. We have a meal. There's an increase in blood glucose. The pancreas will release insulin in response to the increase in blood glucose, and then we'll see a stabilization or return of blood glucose to normal levels. The third is going to be sympathetic activation of the adrenal gland. So what we're going to see here, basically, we have a nerve signal, that's sympathetic activity, and the target is going to be the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal medulla, and that is going to be telling the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Remember, those are the primary chemical messengers associated with the sympathetic nervous system. And so epinephrine and norepinephrine in this situation are going to be considered hormones because they're circulating in the bloodstream. Now, one of the most important things to keep in mind are the solubility characteristics of hormones. We break them down into two general categories. They are either lipid soluble or they are going to be water soluble. There are only three hormones that we consider to be lipid soluble, or classes. One class will be steroids. The other class will be eicosanoids. These are more local messengers, but we'll talk about them a little bit later. And then we have thyroid hormone. Technically, thyroid hormone is what we refer to as a biogenic amine, but it actually functions as a lipid-soluble hormone. Now, if you are not one of those three, so if you're not a steroid, if you're not an eicosanoid, and you're not a thyroid hormone, then you are going to be water-soluble. It's that simple. Okay, we only have three we consider to be lipid-soluble, and if you're not one of those three, you will be water-soluble. Now, the first class here is going to be steroids. These are hormones that are all derived from cholesterol. This is why they are lipid soluble. Examples are going to be our gonadal steroids. So it could be testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, depending upon the gonad. We'll look at steroids that are synthesized by the adrenal cortex. So cortisol would be a good example. And sometimes calcitriol will be considered a steroid. But keep in mind, this is actually the activated form of vitamin D, which is a lipid-soluble vitamin. Now, biogenic amines. So these are modified amino acids, and they consist of catecholamines, thyroid hormone, and melatonin. But remember what we talked about previously. Thyroid hormone is lipid soluble, so even though it is one of these modified amines, it is still lipid soluble. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, catecholamines, they are a very important class of circulating hormones. Examples are going to be dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. We already have put a significant emphasis on epinephrine and norepinephrine as, once again, they are the primary chemical messengers that are associated with the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the largest class of hormones are going to be proteins or peptide hormones. They are made up of long amino acid chains, and they account for the majority of hormones that we find in humans. So they're water soluble, and examples would be ADH or antidiuretic hormone, insulin, glucagon, erythropoietin or EPO, and growth hormone. Now, this last slide here is a slide that is no longer in our textbook, but I thought it was important to include eicosanoids, and why do we consider them to be lipid soluble? They are lipid soluble because they're derived from the plasma membrane. So that is their lipid nature. The thing to keep in mind here, eicosanoids do not circulate in the bloodstream. They act as what we refer to as autocrines or paracrines, and this refers to secretion and target of those secretions. A really good example are going to be prostaglandins, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. Typically, these eicosanoids are local chemical messengers, and they exert their role by playing a role within the inflammatory response. So keep that in mind.